Hello, friends, and welcome back to The Free Advantage. I'm your host, Heather Davis, and I want to invite you into a new season of real stories, real recovery, and real freedom. This show has always been about self-discovery, authenticity, and recovering a life of freedom. And this year, we are taking that journey together in a deeper way. You're going to hear raw, honest conversations with people walking this path in real time. Stories of growth, healing, purpose, and becoming whole. You'll also hear from me as I reflect on these themes that rise from the stories, answer your questions, and offer small, meaningful takeaways that you can carry back into your week. This is not just a podcast you listen to. It's a place you belong, where you are part of the conversation. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining me today as I continue to deep dive into the themes and the topics that came up with my conversation with Lillian Blake a couple of weeks back. If you haven't, I encourage you to go listen to the episode where she came on and shared her story. She's a beautiful young lady. She was 20 years old, sharing her story of addiction and sobriety. It's episode 73. If you want to go and listen to that. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about today was a quiet grief, something that it comes up a lot that not a lot of us talk about. And, in recovery, whether, I'm going to restate it again, whether that be an addiction or from an injury or illness or possibly divorce or our trauma, there's many types of recovery, but wherever we are in the journey, somewhere along the line, maybe you have in the past, maybe you are suffering from that now, is suffering them in silence of the thing that sometimes we don't always understand why, or we didn't realize was going to happen. And that is one of the hardest parts about growth, is that sometimes not everybody can come with us. And Lily had shared that when she started her sobriety journey, that it was something unexpected that happened to her. And she said, it wasn't just my habits that changed. She goes, it was all of my relationships too. And she realized that a lot of her relationships were just solely based on their drinking. And I think that's something that, a lot of us don't understand, or we don't see. We talk about trauma bonding and why we have relationships, but not all relationships are built on connection. A lot of them are built on conditions, our shared habits, shared traumas, our shared environments, and sometimes even shared avoidance. So not all relationships are built on who we are. They're built on kind of the things that, like, what we do together. And, Lily had found herself in that space. Last week a couple weeks back, we didn't have the conversation about when she mentioned when she got sober, her husband was still drinking, and then he eventually got sober, and how blessed she was that he actually joined her on that journey, because it doesn't always happen. And a lot of relationships come to an end because of that, or you really do suffer a lot in silence from the dynamics of that relationship having now changed. But she said even when he got sober that, his friends stopped talking. They stopped talking to him. They started hanging out. And the conversation I want to have today is like, why does that happen? Why do we lose people? Why do our relationships stop? Why can they not continue as they were? And it's for a lot of reasons, right? For one, that growth disrupts the dynamic. It disrupts the dynamic, especially for young kids that they're out drinking and they're partying. Like, if one of you stops, one of you gets sober, that kind of like puts a little damper on everything, right? Like, nobody wants the sober guy like ruining my good time. So it definitely can disrupt the dynamic, right? It also can make people feel uncomfortable. And why is this? I found that as you start growing, as you start changing, you start healing, that can put, like, it's a mirror for people. And it kind of puts some of the things that they're doing in their face, and it can make people feel wildly uncomfortable. And so it kind of, pushes people away. They kind of like, well, that's you over there, and now I'm doing this. And, and also you stop playing the role. We are the main character in our universe, right? But everybody else is also the main character of their universe, right? And you are the supporting role. And if that role is no longer supporting where they're going and what they're doing in their life, then, the dynamic, like I said, changes and it doesn't work, and you're no longer playing the role that they want you to play. And so when you change, right, the relationship has to change. And to be honest, not everyone is willing to do that, right? And it's not always that people can't come with you. It's that they're not willing to come with you. Or sometimes they're just not even willing to accept where you're going. Now with Lily being a year into her journey, she stated that it is hard for her to relate to people her own age now, right? And being young and being 20 years old, I can see how that definitely is the case. If you're focused on healing and growing, not a lot of people, at that age are focused on that. I mean, there are a bunch who are, but in her world, there just wasn't, right? And she feels different, right? The conversations don't hit the same. They can't talk about the same things. And what used to feel fun for her back then with them, it now kind of feels empty. And she's not doing the same things anymore, right? A lot of them are talking about, parties, or they talk about drinking. And she's in this space where she doesn't do or talk about any of that anymore, right? And it can really make our growth and our healing and our recovery journey feel very isolated, right? It can make us feel very lonely, right? Because what we do know is that misery likes company, right? So, that's why it's okay when things are all going haywire in our lives, because people normalize dysfunction. This world is literally based off of dysfunction. I mean, everything seems dysfunctional. You get on social media and you're just like, I read the comments on social media and everybody is like, how did this get in my feed? Right? Like, what algorithm did I walk into? And a lot of this is because so much of what we see feels so out of place. It feels so much out of alignment from where we are. And when you try to step back into a place where you no longer are, it can invite you back into your old patterns. It can invite you back into that old way of thinking. And when it's like that, even the people who are in the place where you used to be, they can, and some want to, and it's unfortunate, but they can minimize your growth. They can try to pull you back into that space. They can try to convince you that it's okay and that you're really not, that wasn't that bad of a thing you were doing. Or even, not just with drinking, but think about toxic relationships, right? Is that, it wasn't that bad. We even try to convince ourselves of those things. But the truth is that our growth, though sometimes it can be lonely, sometimes it can feel like we're extremely isolated, this is actually us coming into alignment with who we really are. And I think sometimes that's really hard for us to understand because it doesn't feel like it, right? It does not feel like alignment when you're alone. I think it's why it's super important for us to find community and to find the right kind of support, whether you have friends who are not in the old space that you used to be in, whether it's family members, whether it's a coach, whether it's a pastor, whether it's a counselor or a therapist. It is super important that we find the right kinds of support and tools to help us along the way in our recovery journey, because it can feel that way. And sometimes those feelings can kind of drive us back to doing the very thing that we are moving away from. It's hard. I'll be the first. Obviously I'm not the first to say it, but it's hard. It's hard when you're moving forward and everybody else is kind of, staying in the same place. And, I want to keep talking and reiterating, but I know that sometimes our change can reflect others' stagnation. Us setting boundaries removes access to us that they may have once had, and it breaks old agreements, right? You think about certain things. Well, we used to do this together and now we're not doing that. Or I used to could do this with you, or I used to could come over here at this time. I used to could just come in and out of your house. There's a lot of things that sometimes that when you're healing, it breaks the agreement that you had with some people. It breaks the those are boundaries, and they kind of kill the access that some people once had. And a lot of people just don't, not only do they not like it, they don't understand it. People who are not in the space that you're in, if they're not in a space of healing, they're not in a space of recovery, especially when, like we're talking about with Lily with addiction, it's very difficult for people to understand, especially if they don't have a problem like you did, if they don't have an addiction issue, or, they do and they haven't come to that understanding or awareness yet, for them, you're not just changing your life, you're changing the version of you that they're used to, the one that they know and they understand. And, here's the thing. Lily said it herself, and I quote her, "Real friends will not let you ruin your life." And I want us to think about that for a minute. I want you to think about the people in your life. If you find yourself in a state of recovery, if you find yourself in a state where you're trying to move forward, you're trying to move away from old things, I want you to think about the people in your life. Are they cheering for you? Are they rooting for you? Or are they trying to continue to keep you where you're at? Are they trying to convince you to stay? Because this is the truth. Real friends will not let you run your life. And sometimes we have to understand that the people who end up cheering us on are not the same people that we started with. So how do we navigate it? How do we navigate outgrowing people, outgrowing relationships? One of the things I want to give you is to recognize the type of relationship that you have. Understand what it is. Is this connection? Is this something that I truly do have? Or is this out of convenience? Is this out of a habit? Ask yourself, is this a growth relationship, or I'm in this relationship out of comfort? And, the second thing you can do when you're in these kinds of relationships is to stop explaining your growth. You don't owe anybody an explanation, and you don't have to ask for permission to do so. I think as we get into these kinds of relationships, we don't realize that so many people feel entitled to you. They feel entitled to what you do, what you know, how you move in the world. And if you choose to do something different and they don't like that, they feel like they have a right to you. And the truth is, it's just not true, right? And, thirdly, you need to really allow the distance. Sometimes distance, it gives perspective. Right? Now, it doesn't happen for everyone, but sometimes with friendships, just having some distance and allowing you to change and allowing them space to accept what's happening, it can help. Not everything has to be a dramatic ending. Not all relationships come to an end. Some just need to learn to come to acceptance and understanding. And some relationships will just naturally fade away. You have to let it be what it is, without forcing it to be what it was anymore. And fourth, find yourself aligned spaces. Like I said, it's not just new relationships, new people, but new places to be. If you're like Lily and used to party and used to have parties at your house, or you would go to somebody else's house, or used to go over here and these things would happen, find new room, find new conversations to be having, find a new environment to go hang out at. Lily found community through recovery and what she was doing, and the people around her that were working in that same, field or working in that same realm. She found other people in recovery, and instead of drinking, she found that instead of that, right? Because that's where we want to be. You surround yourself with the people that, are like-minded and are helping you and supporting you and nurturing you in the ways in which you're wanting to go. And, we can always, take this space and try to reframe it, right? That, you're not just losing people. You're not just losing people, but that you are truly making space for the right ones in your life. And you're also making space for yourself. I think that I always tie everything back to authenticity because that's what we're looking for. It's our identity. It's our identity, right? And your friends found your identity in maybe your addiction, but now your identity is in who you are who you truly are, where you're trying to come back to that true, authentic self. And in your recovery, you're learning to find that, and you're having to create space for that. And sometimes we have to eliminate certain things in our life in order for that to happen. And sometimes those friends could come back, and sometimes they don't. It's always about our true self. It's always about who we really are, right? And if you feel like you don't fit where you used to, I want to just put this out there because I know what happens when you're walking away from something. If it feels like you don't fit there anymore, right? And now you don't quite fit over here yet either. I want you to know you don't fit back there because you never did. You were never meant to be back there, right? And over here, this feels uncomfortable, and you don't fit here because it is uncomfortable. You don't know it. It's uncertain, right? But there is nothing wrong with choosing what's right for you. There's nothing wrong with choosing freedom. So when we think about our journey, when we think sometimes about the suffering of losing people, having to walk away from things, I know that, with Lily, it was her friends, right? It was relationships, but with so many others, it's more than just friendship. Sometimes it's our spouse. Sometimes it's our home. Sometimes it's our church. Sometimes it's a community. Sometimes it's our job. And it can feel, I know, overwhelming when we are suffering a loss at the hand of our growth. But I encourage you to keep moving forward. There is hope in that. There is life in that, and there is freedom in that. And I want you to know that if you are suffering silently, or even not silently, but if you are experiencing this kind of grief in your recovery, please know you are not alone. You are not alone. And if you struggle finding community, if you struggle finding support, I would love to be that for you. You can always reach out to me. You can go to my website. You can message me on my email. It's heather@theriskypath.com. And I don't want you to ever feel like you're alone, and that there's not help out there, and that there's not support for you out there, because there is. Thank you so much for joining me today. Just remember, on your path, no matter where you're going, no matter where you've come from, if you are walking the risky path and you are walking into recovery, if you are walking into your healing, you're doing your best to grow, just know that freedom is there. It is on the other side of all of these things, and that you are willing to do it. Take pride in that. And remember that freedom is the advantage you already own.